Imagine standing in a room colder than ice, surrounded by the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of machines keeping a billionaire heiress alive. Now imagine being handed a heavy gold fountain pen, a binding contract, and an impossible choice. Marry this motionless stranger right here, right now, or watch your own family lose absolutely everything. For 22-year-old Elias, it was not a choice at all. It was the end of his own life as he knew it. He was just a struggling mechanic from the wrong side of the tracks, drowning in insurmountable medical debt. She was Isabella Sterling, the untouchable, glamorous heir to a global empire, locked in a deep, mysterious coma. They told Elias it was just a formality, a temporary business transaction to protect her assets from vultures. But the exact moment he slipped that heavy diamond wedding band onto her pale, lifeless finger, the steady beep of her heart monitor spiked into a frantic rhythm. And Elias realized with a cold dread that he had not just signed a marriage certificate. He had just been dragged into a very deadly, high-stakes conspiracy. Welcome to HeartNest Stories, where we bring you the most captivating, emotional, and unbelievable tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. If you love stories that tug at your heartstrings and keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button, grab a warm drink, and let us dive into today's incredible journey. The smell of motor oil and cheap stale coffee was something Elias had grown so accustomed to that it felt like his natural scent. For the past 4 years, ever since his father passed away and left them with a mountain of debt, Elias had been working double shifts at a rundown auto shop in downtown Chicago. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his knuckles scarred from slipping wrenches, and his eyes carried the heavy, exhausted look of a man twice his age. He did not mind the hard work. What he minded was the fact that no matter how many hours he put in, it was never enough. His younger sister, Lily, had been diagnosed with a rare respiratory condition, and the medical bills were piling up faster than he could read them. The bank had already sent their third notice of foreclosure on their tiny, drafty apartment. Elias was at the end of his rope, staring down the barrel of homelessness, when the sleek, bulletproof black Maybach pulled into the dusty parking lot of his auto shop, looking like an alien spaceship in a junkyard. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elias made in a year. This was Marcus Thorne, the chief legal counsel and most trusted fixer for the Sterling family. Elias wiped his hands on a greasy rag, confused and cautious, as Marcus approached him without a hint of hesitation. Marcus did not beat around the bush. He knew everything about Elias. He knew about the debt, he knew about Lily's medical condition, and he knew exactly how desperate Elias was. Marcus handed Elias a thick manila folder and made a proposition that sounded absolutely insane. Elias was to marry Isabella Sterling. Isabella had been in a severe car crash 3 months prior, an accident that left her in a persistent vegetative state. The doctors said she might never wake up. But the Sterling empire was vast, and her uncle, Victor Sterling, was circling like a hungry shark. According to a bizarre, archaic clause in Isabella's late grandfather's will, if she was incapacitated and unmarried by her 25th birthday, which was only a week away, control of the company and her entire trust fund would default to her closest living relative, her Uncle Victor. A man who, rumor had it, was the very reason the brakes on Isabella's sports car had failed in the first place. Arthur Sterling, Isabella's fiercely protective grandfather, who was now too frail to run the company, had orchestrated this desperate plan. They needed a proxy husband, someone legally bound to her, someone who would inherit the proxy voting rights to keep Uncle Victor out of the chairman's seat. They needed someone utterly unconnected to their world, someone desperate enough to take the money and keep their mouth shut, and someone who wouldn't try to actually claim a piece of the empire. They had vetted hundreds of candidates, and Elias was chosen because of his spotless criminal record, his desperate financial situation, and his reputation for being fiercely loyal to his family. The offer was staggering. $5 million transferred immediately into Elias's account, full coverage of Lily's medical expenses at the best private facility in the country, and a guaranteed trust for his mother. All he had to do was sign the papers, stand by the hospital bed, say "I do" in front of a private judge, and remain legally married to a woman he had never met until she either woke up or passed away. If he agreed, he would be moved into the Sterling. Estate to keep up appearances. Elias read the contract in the dingy break room of the auto shop, the numbers blurring in front of his eyes. $5 million. It was blood money, essentially. He was selling his freedom, his future, and his name to a corporate chessboard. But as he looked at a photo of Lily hooked up to her oxygen tank on his phone, the choice made itself. He signed on the dotted line. Within 24 hours, Elias's life was violently uprooted. He was scrubbed down, dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, and driven to an ultra-exclusive, private medical wing on the top floor of a high-rise hospital. The room didn't look like a hospital room. It looked like a penthouse suite, save for the state-of-the-art medical equipment humming quietly in the background. And there she was, Isabella Sterling, even pale and motionless, with an four-line in the back of her delicate hand and a ventilator tube resting near her face. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She had raven black hair that spilled over the pristine white pillows like dark silk, and features so perfect they looked sculpted from marble. Elias felt a profound sense of sadness wash over him. Here was a woman who had everything, billions of dollars, power, status, reduced to a fragile, sleeping figure, being used as a pawn by her own family to protect their wealth. The ceremony was cold, brief, and surreal. An older judge muttered the legalities while Arthur Sterling watched from a wheelchair, his eyes sharp and calculating. Marcus stood as a witness. When it was time for the rings, Elias took the cold, limp hand of the billionaire heiress. Her skin felt like porcelain. As he slid the heavy, custom-made diamond ring onto her finger, he leaned in, feeling a strange urge to apologize to her. "I'm sorry," he whispered so only she could hear. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but I promise I'll protect you." That was the moment the heart monitor beside them let out a rapid, startling series of blips. The line jumped, fluttering wildly for just 3 seconds before settling back into a steady rhythm. The doctors rushed in, but everything was stable. Elias, however, couldn't shake the feeling that she had heard him. Moving into the Sterling Manor was like stepping into a gilded cage. The estate was massive, a sprawling mansion nestled on a cliff overlooking the ocean, filled with priceless art, marble floors, and an army of staff. Elias felt completely out of place. He missed the smell of oil and the honest labor of the garage. Now his only job was to be the grieving, devoted husband. The staff treated him with thinly veiled contempt, viewing him as a gold-digging street rat who had somehow conned his way into the family. The worst of it came from Uncle Victor. Victor was a tall, imposing man with cold eyes and a fake, terrifying smile. On Elias's first night at the mansion, Victor cornered him in the library. He poured a glass of scotch, didn't offer one to Elias, and leaned against the mahogany desk. Victor made it abundantly clear that he knew Elias was a hired prop. He offered Elias $10 million to walk away, to sign annulment papers citing fraud. When Elias refused, remembering his promise to Arthur and the medical care Lily was now receiving, Victor's smile vanished. "You're playing a very dangerous game, boy," Victor sneered, stepping close enough for Elias to smell the expensive cologne and bitter alcohol. "Isabella is practically a corpse. When her heart finally stops, and it will stop soon, I will make sure you are left with nothing but a target on your back." That threat ignited something in Elias. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a husband, even if only on paper, to a woman who had no one else to fight for her. He began spending every day at the private medical wing. While the rest of the family only visited for photo ops to appease the board of directors, Elias actually sat with her. He would bring his laptop and read to her. He read her the news. He read her cheap pulp fiction novels because he figured she was probably bored of high society literature, and he talked to her. He talked about his life growing up poor in the city, about the time he accidentally set a rusted Chevy on fire, and about how much he loved his sister Lily. He noticed things the nurses didn't. He noticed that her heart rate would subtly increase when he read action scenes. He noticed that when he held her hand, her fingers felt less rigid. He started doing his own research into her accident. The police report said it was a simple case of brake failure on a winding coastal road, but Elias, being a mechanic, knew cars. He managed to get his hands on the insurance photos of Isabella's wrecked Aston Martin. It didn't take him long to see the cut lines. The brakes hadn't failed, they had been sabotaged. Someone had tried to murder Isabella, and Elias was absolutely certain it was Victor. Things escalated quickly. One rainy Tuesday evening, Elias arrived at the medical suite earlier than usual. The private wing was eerily quiet. The usual security guard was missing from his post. Elias felt a cold prickle of alarm at the base of his neck. He sprinted down the pristine white hallway and threw open the door to Isabella's room. A man in a nurse's uniform was leaning over her bed, holding a syringe filled with a cloudy substance, aiming directly for her foreline. Elias didn't think, he just reacted. He tackled the man to the ground, the syringe clattering across the polished floor. A brutal fight broke out. The man was trained, landing heavy blows to Elias's ribs and jaw, but Elias had grown up fighting in the streets. Adrenaline and sheer protective rage fueled him. He managed to land a devastating right hook that knocked the assassin out cold. Panting, bleeding from a cut above his eye, Elias hit the emergency panic button. When security and the police finally arrived, the assassin clammed up, but Elias knew exactly who had sent him. The assassination attempt changed everything. Arthur Sterling ordered the medical wing to be locked down like a fortress, but Elias knew it wasn't enough. As long as Isabella was in a hospital, she was vulnerable. With the help of Marcus Thorne, Elias made a bold decision. They quietly moved Isabella and all her life support equipment to a heavily fortified safe house on the outskirts of the city, a property technically owned by Elias through a shell company he bought with his advance money. For the next 2 months, Elias barely slept. He became her sole protector, working alongside a hand-picked, private medical team. And then, the miracle happened. It was a quiet midnight. Elias was sitting in the dimly lit room, holding her hand, quietly talking about a stray dog he used to feed behind the auto shop. He felt a twitch. He stopped talking. He stared at her hand. Another twitch. Then, slowly, painfully, her fingers curled around his. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. He looked up at her face. Her eyelids were fluttering. He hit the call button for the private doctor, but he never let go of her hand. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Isabella, can you hear me?" Slowly, her heavy eyelids parted. For the first time, Elias saw her eyes. They were a stunning, striking shade of hazel, filled with confusion, fear, and a groggy haze. She looked at the ceiling, then at the machines, and finally, she turned her head weakly to look at the battered, exhausted young man holding her hand. "Who?" she croaked, her voice dry and unused. "Who are you?" The recovery was grueling. For the first few weeks, Isabella was furious, confused, and deeply depressed. Waking up to find out you've been asleep for nearly half a year, that someone tried to murder you, and that you are now legally married to a complete stranger from the slums of Chicago is a lot for anyone to process. Initially, she was incredibly cold to Elias. She assumed he was just an opportunist, a gold digger who took advantage of her grandfather's desperation. She treated him like an employee, barking orders from her bed and demanding he stay out of her sight. Elias took the verbal lashings quietly. He understood her anger. He brought her meals, helped the nurses adjust her pillows, and sat outside her door at night, guarding it like a watchdog. One evening, while going through the financial files Marcus had brought her, Isabella realized the extent of what Elias had done. She saw the police report of the assassination attempt. She saw the transfer of the property to keep her safe. She asked Marcus about it. Marcus, with his usual stoic demeanor, told her everything. He told her how Elias had refused Victor's $10 million bribe. He told her how Elias had taken a beating to save her life, and how he hadn't touched a single dime of her trust fund. Isabella sat in silence for a long time. Later that night, when the house was quiet, she called out for him. Elias walked in, looking tired, expecting another scolding. Instead, Isabella looked at him with a softness he had never seen before. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why did you risk your life for me? You didn't even know me. You got your money. You could have walked away." Elias shoved his hands into his pockets and looked at the floor. "Because it wasn't right," he said simply. "You were helpless. And where I come from, you don't abandon someone when they're down. Plus, I made a promise when I put that ring on your finger. I told you I'd protect you. I don't break my promises." From that night on, the ice between them began to thaw. As Isabella regained her strength, undergoing grueling physical therapy to walk again, Elias was right there beside her. He became her literal crutch. When she stumbled, he caught her, When she cried out in frustration, he made her laugh with terrible mechanic jokes and sarcastic remarks. She discovered he had a sharp, brilliant mind beneath his rough exterior, a mind that understood mechanical engineering on a level that rivaled the top designers at her own automotive manufacturing company. And Elias discovered that the Ice Queen, Billionaire Heiress, was actually incredibly warm, fiercely loyal, and carried the heavy burden of a legacy she never really asked for. They started spending hours just talking, sitting on the porch of the safe house, drinking coffee. They were two people from completely different universes, forced together by tragedy, but finding solace in each other. Elias found himself admiring her resilience, the fiery determination in her hazel eyes. Isabella found herself feeling safer with this poor mechanic than she had ever felt in the ivory towers of the Sterling Empire. She found herself staring at his rough, calloused hands, realizing they were the most gentle hands she had ever known. But their quiet sanctuary was shattered when Victor finally tracked them down. Victor had grown impatient. With the annual shareholder meeting approaching, where the CEO position would be permanently decided, Victor needed Isabella out of the picture for good. He hired a team of elite mercenaries to breach the safe house. It was a terrifying, chaotic night. The power was cut. Windows shattered as armed men stormed the perimeter. Elias and Isabella were trapped on the second floor. Isabella was still too weak to run fast, her legs burning with the effort. Elias grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker, the only weapon he could find. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. When the first mercenary kicked down the bedroom door, Elias swung with all his might, taking the man out. He grabbed the mercenary's discarded sidearm, checking the clip with an instinctive efficiency that surprised even himself. Together, they navigated the dark, sprawling house. Elias fought like a cornered lion, taking down two more men in the hallway to protect his wife. Yes, his wife. In that moment of life and death, he realized he didn't just view her as an obligation anymore. He was desperately, completely in love with her. They made it to the garage, where Elias had been tinkering with an old, reinforced vintage Mustang. He shoved Isabella into the passenger seat, hot-wired the ignition because the keys were upstairs, and slammed his foot on the gas. They busted through the heavy wooden garage doors, tires squealing as bullets shattered the back windshield. Elias drove like a madman, losing the pursuit in the winding back roads of the countryside. When they finally pulled over at a deserted gas station miles away, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the dashboard. Isabella was shaking, adrenaline crashing through her system. Elias leaned over, cupping her face in his dirty, blood-stained hands, checking her for injuries. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice frantic. Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing the raw, unmasked terror for her safety. She didn't answer his question. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a desperate, passionate kiss, tasting of fear, relief, and undeniable love. When they pulled away, she rested her forehead against his. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Because of you." The final showdown took place not with guns, but in the boardroom. Isabella, leaning on Elias's arm, walked into the Sterling Enterprise headquarters on the morning of the shareholder meeting. The room, filled with wealthy investors and board members, fell completely silent. They looked like they had seen a ghost. Victor, who was standing at the head of the table preparing to take the oath as the new CEO, dropped his pen. His face went ashen. Isabella didn't just walk in to reclaim her company. She walked in with a mountain of evidence. While Elias had been keeping them safe, Marcus Thorne had been busy digging up the financial trail connecting Victor to the assassin and the sabotaged brakes. Isabella slammed the files onto the mahogany table. She fired Victor on the spot and had security hold him until the police arrived to arrest him for attempted murder and corporate fraud. As the dust settled and Victor was dragged away in handcuffs, screaming threats, the board erupted in applause. Isabella stood tall, the undisputed leader of the Sterling Empire. But as she looked around the room filled with people in expensive suits, her eyes sought out only one person. Elias was standing near the back doors, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, clearly feeling like he didn't belong in this world of billions and boardrooms. He gave her a soft, proud smile and started to turn away, thinking his job was finally done. He had protected her. She was safe, The contract was fulfilled. But Isabella wasn't going to let him go. She pushed past the crowding executives, ignoring the flashing cameras of the press that had gathered outside. She walked right up to Elias, grabbing his hand tightly. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, a teasing smile playing on her lips. Elias shrugged, looking down. "Back to the shop, I guess. You don't need a proxy husband anymore, Isabella. You got your life back." Isabella shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want a proxy husband, Elias. I want you. The man who sat by my bed when I was broken. The man who fought for me. I don't care about the money or the company if I have to go home to an empty house. Please, stay." Elias looked into her eyes, seeing the absolute sincerity shining there. He smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace in front of the entire boardroom. The poor mechanic and the billionaire heiress, bound first by a cold contract, were now forever bound by an unbreakable love. And as they walked out of the building together, hand in hand, Elias knew that sometimes the most impossible circumstances can lead you to exactly where you belong. The transition from a desperate, paper-bound proxy marriage to a genuine, breathing relationship was not without its hurdles. For the first few months after Victor's arrest, the media was relentless. Helicopters hovered over the Sterling estate, and paparazzi camped out by the main gates, desperate for a shot of the Cinderella mechanic who had somehow captured the heart of America's most elusive billionaire heiress. Elias hated the attention. He was a man accustomed to the quiet anonymity of the greasy underbelly of Chicago, not the blinding flashbulbs of high society. He felt like an imposter in the bespoke suits Isabella bought for him, and he constantly worried that he was holding her back. But Isabella was fiercely protective of their new life. She fired any staff member who dared to look at Elias with disdain and completely cleared her schedule every evening just to sit with him on the floor of their massive living room, eating takeout pizza and watching terrible action movies. Their worlds truly began to merge when Lily was finally discharged from the private medical facility. Thanks to the world-class treatment funded by Isabella, Lily's respiratory condition had stabilized remarkably. The day Elias brought his little sister to the Sterling estate, he was a nervous wreck. He worried that the sheer scale of the mansion would intimidate her, or worse, that Isabella wouldn't know how to interact with a shy, recovering teenager from the wrong side of the tracks. He couldn't have been more wrong. Isabella, who had grown up in a cold, calculating household completely devoid of sibling warmth, instantly took to Lily. She transformed one of the sunniest guest suites into a teenager's paradise, filled with art supplies and books. She spent hours brushing Lily's hair, listening to her talk about school, and sharing her own stories of sneaking out of boarding school. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt like she had a real family, and Elias watched, his heart swelling with a love so profound it physically ached, as the two most important women in his life became inseparable. However, the corporate world was not as forgiving as the walls of their home. While Isabella had successfully reclaimed her throne as CEO, the board of directors remained deeply skeptical of Elias. To them, he was a liability, an uneducated blue-collar worker who had no business mingling with the elite minds of Sterling Enterprise. Whispers echoed through the mahogany hallways whenever he visited the headquarters. They called him a charity case, a gold digger who had just gotten lucky. Elias tried to ignore it, focusing on rebuilding his own life. He had flat out refused to let Isabella just give him an executive title. He didn't want handouts. Instead, he took a tiny fraction of his original settlement money and opened his own custom auto restoration shop on the outskirts of the city. He called it Second Chances. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could wipe away the stress of high society with the familiar grease and grime of an engine block. But fate had a funny way of bringing his two worlds crashing together. Sterling Motors, the flagship automotive division of Isabella's empire, was facing a massive crisis. Their highly anticipated next-generation hybrid engine, a project that had consumed billions of dollars in research and development, was failing miserably in testing. The engine kept overheating, the prototypes were stalling on the track, and the lead engineers were baffled. The stock price was beginning to tank, and the board was breathing down Isabella's neck, implicitly blaming her recent personal distractions for the corporate failure. Elias could see the toll it was taking on her. She was coming home late, her hazel eyes shadowed with exhaustion, pacing the floor as she took endless, stressful phone calls. One weekend, While Isabella was trying to catch up on sleep, Elias quietly slipped into her home office. He found the massive stacks of blueprints and technical readouts for the failing hybrid engine scattered across her desk. Elias wasn't a classically trained engineer. He didn't have a degree from MIT or Stanford. But he had spent his entire life taking apart broken machines and figuring out how to make them run again. He had an intuitive, almost terrifying understanding of combustion and mechanics. He poured a cup of black coffee, sat down at her desk, and began to read. Hours turned into days. He started bringing the blueprints to his custom shop, building crude, scaled-down models of the cooling systems using scrap metal and old car parts. He realized the Sterling engineers had overcomplicated the design. They were relying on software to fix a fundamental physical flaw in the airflow. 2 weeks later, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. The atmosphere in the glass-walled conference room was suffocating. The lead engineer, a pompous man with 3 PhDs, was sweating profusely as he explained that they would have to scrap the entire project and start over, a move that would cost the company billions and severely damage their reputation. Isabella sat at the head of the table, her face an unreadable mask, though her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Just as the board members began to murmur aggressively about leadership changes, the heavy doors of the conference room swung open. Elias walked in. He wasn't wearing a borrowed tuxedo this time. He was wearing dark jeans, heavy work boots, and a simple black button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing his scarred forearms. He carried a heavy, grease-stained cardboard box. The room fell dead silent. A senior board member scoffed loudly. "Security. Get this mechanic out of here. This is a classified corporate meeting." Isabella held up a hand, silencing the man instantly. Her eyes locked onto Elias, flashing with confusion but unwavering trust. "Let him speak," she commanded. Elias walked right past the sneering executives and set the heavy box down in the center of the pristine mahogany table. He pulled out a piece of chalk and a series of modified, hand-welded steel components. Without a word of introduction, he started drawing on the glass whiteboard wall. He didn't use fancy corporate jargon. He spoke in the language of pistons, airflow, and raw mechanics. He explained that the thermal manifold they were using was trapping heat because of a design flaw in the intake valves. He passed around the crude steel components he had welded in his shop. "You guys are trying to use a supercomputer to tell a fire not to burn," Elias said, his voice steady and commanding in a way Isabella had never heard before. "You don't need new software. You need to let the engine breathe. If you bypass the secondary coolant loop and redirect the intake through these modified valves, the ambient airflow naturally regulates the core temperature." The lead engineer stared at Elias's chalk drawings, his jaw practically hitting the floor. The mathematics were crude, but the mechanical logic was undeniably, infuriatingly brilliant. It was a street-smart, practical solution that a room full of theoretical physicists had completely overlooked. The engineer hastily grabbed his tablet, running Elias's physical adjustments through their simulation software. The room waited in a tense, suffocating silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the simulation beeped green. The overheating issue was completely resolved. The engine efficiency actually increased by 12%. The silence that followed was deafening. The board members, who had spent months whispering about Elias behind his back, were now staring at him in absolute awe. Isabella slowly stood up, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. She looked at the arrogant executives, then back to her husband, her heart bursting with an overwhelming sense of pride. Elias didn't gloat. He just wiped a smudge of chalk off his hands, looked at the lead engineer, and said, "You can keep the prototype parts. Just make sure they're cast in aerospace-grade aluminum, not the cheap stuff." He turned to Isabella, offering a gentle smile. "I'm going to head back to the shop. We still on for dinner tonight?" That day changed everything. Elias was no longer the Cinderella mechanic. He became a highly paid, exclusive mechanical consultant for Sterling Motors, operating strictly out of his own shop. He refused a corner office, preferring the smell of motor oil to the scent of expensive cologne. He and Isabella became the most formidable power couple in the city. She handled the billion-dollar acquisitions and corporate strategy, while he ensured that the actual products had the heart and soul of true craftsmanship. Years later, the safe house where they had fought for their lives was completely renovated. It was no longer a fortress hiding a terrified heiress. It was a home. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls, chasing after a golden retriever that looked suspiciously like the stray Elias used to feed in the alleys of Chicago. Lily was off at a prestigious university, studying to become a pediatric pulmonologist. One quiet Sunday evening, Elias and Isabella sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Isabella leaned her head against Elias's shoulder, intertwining her fingers with his. She traced the calluses on his palms, smiling softly. "Do you ever think about the day Marcus walked into your auto shop?" she asked quietly. Elias wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Every single day," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "It was the day my life ended, and the day my real life began." They sat in the peaceful silence, a testament to the unpredictable, chaotic, and beautiful nature of destiny. A contract born of desperation had saved an empire, but more importantly, it had saved them both. The peace they had fought so fiercely to build was a beautiful, fragile thing, and like all fragile things in the world of billionaires, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to break it. The first sign of trouble didn't come wrapped in a corporate subpoena or a threatening phone call. It rolled right up to the bay doors of Elias's custom shop, Second Chances. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. The shop was mostly empty, the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the tin roof providing a soothing backdrop to the sparks flying from Elias's welding torch. He was working on restoring a classic 1969 Chevrolet Camaro for a local client when the low, menacing growl of a V12 engine pierced the quiet. Elias lifted his welding mask. A matte silver Pagani Huayra, a car that cost more than most entire neighborhoods, idled smoothly in his driveway. The gull-wing doors lifted, and a man stepped out into the drizzle, not even bothering with an umbrella. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, but there was a dangerous, feral grace to the way he moved. He had piercing blue eyes and a sharp jawline that bore an uncanny, unsettling resemblance to Arthur Sterling. Elias wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag, stepping out from the garage bay, his instincts instantly on high alert. The man didn't look at the restored classic cars or the state-of-the-art tools. His eyes locked directly onto Elias with a look of pure, unadulterated amusement. "Elias," the stranger said, his voice smooth like aged bourbon. "The famous mechanic who played knight in shining armor. I have to admit, seeing you in your natural habitat, covered in soot, it makes the stories in the Wall Street Journal seem almost comical." "Shop's closed for walk-ins," Elias replied coldly, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "If you need a tune-up for the spaceship, you'll have to make an appointment. Otherwise, you're trespassing." The man chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "I don't need a mechanic. I need you to deliver a message to my dear sister. Tell Isabella that her older brother is finally home, and I want my half of the kingdom." Elias froze. Isabella had never mentioned a brother. According to every legal document and family history Marcus Thorne had ever provided, Isabella was an only child, the sole surviving heir after her parents died in a boating accident when she was a toddler. But looking at the man's arrogant smirk and the familiar slope of his cheekbones, a cold dread pooled in Elias's stomach. When Elias brought the news home that evening, the warmth of the Sterling estate vanished, replaced by an icy, suffocating tension. Isabella sat in the grand study, her face as pale as it had been during her days in the hospital bed. Marcus Thorne, the ever-stoic family lawyer, was pacing the Persian rug, clutching a thick leather briefcase. The man's name was Julian. He was Isabella's half-brother, born from a secret, tumultuous affair her father had before he married Isabella's mother. To protect the family's pristine public image, Arthur Sterling had paid millions to keep Julian and his mother hidden away in Europe, providing them with a massive silent trust fund on the condition that Julian never set foot in the United States or claimed the Sterling name. "Why now?" Elias asked, leaning against the heavy oak desk, his arms crossed defensively. "Arthur has been dead for years. Victor is rotting in federal prison. Why is he showing up today?" Marcus stopped pacing, his expression grim. "Because the trust fund Arthur set up for him had a stipulation. It ran dry on Julian's 30th birthday, which was last week. Julian is cut off. And according to our private investigators, he hasn't exactly been living a quiet life in Geneva. He has accumulated massive debts. He is heavily involved with an underground European syndicate, people who deal in arms and illegal tech smuggling. They want access to Sterling Motors' global shipping routes. And Julian promised them he could deliver the company. Isabella slammed her hand against the desk, her hazel eyes flashing with a familiar, fierce fire. He has no legal standing. My grandfather's will was ironclad. I own the controlling shares. He can't just walk in and demand half of my company. He doesn't plan to do it legally, Isabella, Elias said softly, his mind racing back to the cold, calculating look in Julian's eyes. A man like that doesn't knock on a mechanic's door just to introduce himself. He was sizing me up. He was sending a threat. The reality of the situation crashed down on them over the next 72 hours. Julian wasn't just a disgruntled relative. He was a highly trained, utterly ruthless adversary who had spent his entire life resenting Isabella's golden existence. The attacks began subtly, targeting the infrastructure of Sterling Enterprise. Mysterious cyber attacks crippled their overseas manufacturing plants. High-ranking executives began receiving anonymous packages containing photos of their children leaving school, prompting sudden, terrifying resignations. The stock price, which had soared after Elias fixed the hybrid engine, began to free fall. But Julian's most devastating strike was personal. It was a Friday night. Elias was driving back from Second Chances, taking the winding coastal road that led up to the Sterling estate. The fog was thick, rolling off the ocean in heavy, blinding waves. He was driving his reinforced vintage Mustang, the same car that had saved their lives years ago. As he rounded a sharp cliffside bend, headlights blazed in his rearview mirror. Not one car, but 3 heavy black SUVs, moving with military precision. They didn't try to pass him, they boxed him in. The SUV in the rear slammed into his bumper, sending a violent jolt through the Mustang. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind went completely cold and clear. He downshifted, the heavy American muscle car roaring as he tried to break out of the formation. But the drivers were professionals. The SUV on his left swiped his side panel, forcing him dangerously close to the flimsy guardrail that separated the road from a 300-foot drop into the churning, black ocean below. Suddenly, his dashboard screen flickered, the Bluetooth system overriding. Julian's smooth, arrogant voice filled the cabin. You drive well for a grease monkey, Elias. But you're playing out of your league. Tell Isabella to sign over 50% of the voting rights by Monday morning, or the next time my men box you in, it won't be a warning tap. It will be a funeral. The call disconnected. The lead SUV slammed its brakes, forcing Elias to swerve violently. The Mustang's tires shrieked, losing traction on the wet asphalt. Elias fought the wheel, pumping the brakes, muscles straining as the car fishtailed, slamming hard into the rock wall of the cliff before finally shuddering to a halt, smoke pouring from the crushed hood. The 3 black SUVs didn't even pause. They melted away into the thick fog like ghosts. Elias sat in the crushed vehicle, his forehead bleeding from where it had struck the steering wheel. He didn't call the police. He knew they were useless against a man backed by a global syndicate. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called the only person he trusted with his life. Isabella. Elias rasped, wiping blood from his eyes. We have a problem. When Elias limped into the estate an hour later, Isabella didn't panic. She didn't cry. The sight of her husband battered and bleeding didn't break her. It forged her into absolute steel. She cleaned his wounds in silence, her hands perfectly steady. The innocent, sleeping heiress Elias had married was completely gone. In her place stood a queen ready to go to war. Marcus, Isabella called out, not looking away from Elias's bruised face. The lawyer stepped into the bathroom, looking grim. Drain the shadow accounts. The ones my grandfather kept hidden for emergencies. Liquidate whatever assets you have to. If Julian wants to use street tactics, we are going to buy the street. Elias grabbed her wrist gently. Isabella, these aren't corporate raiders. These are cartel enforcers. You can't out-litigate them. I don't intend to, Isabella said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You taught me that sometimes a suit and a tie won't save you. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty. She turned to Marcus. Find out exactly where Julian is operating from. I don't care how much it costs. And Elias. She looked back at him, her eyes softening just for a fraction of a second. I need you to build something for me. Not an engine. Armor. The Sterling estate was instantly transformed from a luxurious family home into a high-tech command center. Lily and the children were quietly flown out of the country on a private jet to a secure, undisclosed location. In New Zealand, guarded by top-tier private security, Elias shut down his custom shop and moved all his heavy equipment into the massive underground garage of the estate. For 3 days, he barely slept, surviving on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. He wasn't building cars to go fast anymore. He was building them to survive a war zone. He stripped down Isabella's armored Maybach, reinforcing the chassis with military-grade titanium plating, installing run-flat tires designed for combat vehicles, and rigging the electrical system to withstand EMP blasts. Meanwhile, Marcus's limitless budget yielded results. They tracked Julian's operations to an abandoned shipping port on the industrial edge of the city. He was using it as a staging ground to smuggle the syndicate's illegal weapons, waiting to funnel them through Sterling Motors' legitimate supply chains the moment he seized control of the company. Monday morning arrived. The deadline. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening a massive storm. Isabella stood in the garage, dressed in a sleek black suit, her hair tied back tightly. Elias stood beside her, holding the keys to the heavily modified, armored Maybach. They weren't going to the corporate headquarters to sign away the company. They were going to the shipping port. "Are you sure about this?" Elias asked, his voice rough. Isabella looked at the massive steel vehicle, then up at the man who had pulled her back from the edge of death. "He thought he could scare us into submission. He forgot whose blood runs in my veins. Let's go finish this." The drive to the shipping port was executed in absolute, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic, forceful beating of the windshield wipers against the torrential rain. The industrial edge of the city looked like a graveyard of rust and steel, a labyrinth of towering shipping containers bathed in the eerie, sickly yellow glow of sodium streetlights. As Elias steered the massive, reinforced Maybach into the center of the yard, the trap was instantly sprung. From the shadows of the alleyways, Julian's mercenaries emerged. There were at least 40 of them, armed with military-grade assault rifles, blocking the only exit. A massive freight truck pulled forward, completely sealing them in. Julian stepped out from a corrugated steel warehouse, flanked by 2 towering bodyguards. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a black tactical coat, looking every bit the ruthless syndicate leader he was. He raised a hand, and the mercenaries opened fire. The sound was deafening, a relentless hail of lead tearing through the rain, striking the Maybach from every angle. But Elias's engineering was flawless. The bullets flattened against the titanium plating like rain hitting a tin roof. Inside the cabin, it was shockingly quiet. Isabella didn't even flinch. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes locked on her half-brother. "Now, Elias," she whispered. Elias flipped a series of heavy toggle switches he had wired directly into the center console. "Hold on," he warned, and slammed his hand down on a glowing red button. A high-frequency whine pierced the air, followed by a concussive shockwave of blue light that pulsed outward from the Maybach's undercarriage. It was a localized electromagnetic pulse, rigged from stolen aerospace schematics Elias had memorized years ago. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Every single syndicate SUV died instantly. The floodlights around the port shattered in a shower of sparks. The electronic scopes on the mercenaries' rifles short-circuited. Plunged into sudden, chaotic darkness, the mercenaries panicked. Before Julian could even scream an order, the roar of helicopter blades cut through the storm. High-intensity spotlights pierced down from the sky, pinning Julian and his men like insects on a display board. These weren't Sterling Enterprise security choppers. They bore the stark, bold lettering of the FBI and Interpol. Isabella pushed open the heavy armored door of the Maybach and stepped out into the pouring rain. Elias was right beside her, a heavy wrench gripped loosely in his hand, though he didn't need it. Federal agents were already swarming the yard, heavily armed tactical teams dropping from the choppers and breaching the perimeter fence. Julian's men, realizing they were completely outgunned and their tech was fried, dropped their weapons, falling to their knees. Julian, however, refused to surrender. He lunged toward Isabella, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unhinged rage, pulling a concealed blade from his coat. But Elias was faster. He stepped in front of his wife, caught Julian's wrist with a mechanic's vice-like grip and twisted hard. The knife clattered to the wet pavement. With a swift, brutal strike to the back of Julian's knee, Elias forced him to the ground just as 4 federal agents tackled him, pinning his face against the cold, wet asphalt. Isabella walked up to her brother, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "Did you really think I'd just hand over my grandfather's legacy?" she asked, her voice easily cutting through the chaos of the raid. "While you were busy threatening my husband on a dark road, Marcus was sending every financial record, every smuggling route, and every alias you've ever used straight to the director of Interpol. You didn't just try to steal a company, Julian. You committed international treason on American soil. You are never seeing the light of day again." Julian screamed obscenities as the agents dragged him away, hauling him into the back of an armored transport van. As the sirens wailed and the yard was secured, Isabella let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her exhausted but triumphant. She turned to Elias, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face. Without a word, he dropped the wrench, pulled her into his arms, and held her fiercely. The storm raged around them, but in his embrace, she was completely, untouchably safe. A year later, the Sterling estate was back to its warm, vibrant self. The syndicate was dismantled, Julian was serving a life sentence in a supermax facility, and Sterling Enterprise was stronger than ever. But Isabella had made a massive change. She had stepped down as CEO, handing the reins to a trusted board of directors, retaining only her position as chairwoman. She realized that an empire was worthless if she didn't have time to actually live. On a bright, sunny afternoon, Elias was in his newly reopened, expanded custom shop, wiping grease off his hands. He heard the familiar sound of a highly tuned engine pulling into the driveway. He smiled before he even turned around. Isabella walked in, holding the hand of their beautiful, hazel-eyed newborn daughter, while Lily, home from college for the summer, followed closely behind carrying a picnic basket. Elias walked over, kissed his wife softly, and took his daughter into his arms. Looking around his shop, at the classic cars, the tools, and the family he cherished more than life itself, he knew he was the richest man in the world. And it had absolutely nothing to do with money. It started with a cold, desperate contract, an impossible choice in a sterile hospital room, and a billionaire heiress in a coma. But it ended in the most beautiful, unbreakable love story the world had ever seen. Thank you so much for tuning in to HeartNest Stories. We hope this incredible journey of Elias and Isabella captured your heart just as much as it captured ours. If you love this story of resilience, unexpected romance, and triumph over dark family secrets, please do us a massive favor. Hit that like button, leave a comment down below telling us your favorite part of the story, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another captivating tale. We bring you brand new, emotional, and thrilling stories every single week. Until next time, keep believing in second chances, stay safe, and we will see you in the next HeartNest story.